Meshech Chohma for Parshas Vayeishev. We'll begin with Perek Lamed Zayin, Pasuk Ches, and we'll read the psukim inside. Actually, we'll start with Pasuk Zayin, and then we'll go on to Pasuk Ches. In Pasuk Zayin, Yosef relates to his brothers the first of his two dreams. Etc. And then in Pasuk Ches, Vayomulo Echav, Hamaloch Timloch Aleinu, Imashol Timchalbanu, Vayosifu Od Snow Oso Al Chalomosav, Vial Dvarav. The first question that we want to ask is Rashi's question, and that is, what is Al Dvarav? The last two words of this pasuk seem at face value to be absolutely superfluous, unnecessary. It could have stopped Vayasif Od Snow Sal Chalomosav, and they intensified their hatred against him because of his dreams. But what's the Al Dvarav? Rashi says, Al Dibasam Ra Shahayamevi La'avihem. This goes back to Diba Ra. And if you flip back to the beginning of this whole episode, you will see that in Pasuk Dalid, it says, V'lo yachlu dabro l'shalom. And it says in Pasuk Beis, let's go back to Pasuk Beis, Vunar espinei vilhav espinei zilpa, etc., etc. Vayavei Yosef es dibasam ra'a el avihem. And Rashi goes through the whole medrash about what Diba Ra was and what what gossip he was bringing back to Father Yaakov. But the Ramban is not happy with this Rashi. The Sfardo is not happy with this Rashi. And I believe that the Mefarshim are not happy, not comfortable with this Rashi because the sequence of the psukim is a little bit strange. At the beginning of this whole parsha, Vayavei Yosef es diba samra and Vayisnu oso. Then comes the Chalom in Pasuk Hey, Pasuk Vav, Pasuk Zayin. And at the end of that whole story in Pasuk Ches, in the aftermath and as a reaction to the Chalom, Vayasifu Od Snow So. And it would seem that somehow the Al Dvarav is an extension of Al Chamosav, Chalomosav. Whereas Rashi is learning that the Al Dvarav is going back to the very beginning of the parasha, and it is a result of the Dibasam Ra that Yosef, had brought back to Yaakov. But that doesn't seem to be the simple flow of the psukim. Whatever their response was to Dibasam Ra, that's already recorded earlier in the Torah, in Pasuk Dalid, and Vayisnu Oso. It doesn't make sense now that the Torah would add, in the aftermath of the Chalomos and Yosef relating the Chalomos to the brothers, that therefore they hated him about Dibasam Ra. The Torah has already recorded that they hated him as a result of Dibasam Ra. So this is the perhaps objection of the Rishonim, of many of the Mefarshim, to Rashi's interpretation. So the Ramban, in his commentary, says that the Al Dvarav has to do with the way he spoke about the dreams. And it's an extension of Al Chalomosav. And the Ramban basically says that the brothers were upset because one thing is the dreams and its substance, its content, that itself is Al Chalamosav. But the way that Yosef expressed himself, it sounds like, says the Ramban, he was bragging. He said, Shimu na hachalom hazeh asher chalamti. Listen to what I have to tell you. Like in a sense, a teacher comes into a classroom, if I can give that example, and says, listen up, students. This is a kind of a way that you lord over someone, your superiority. So Yosef is not only telling the Chalomos, he's bragging about the fact that listen to what I heard in the Chalomos. So it's the way he conveyed the Chalomos that already goes beyond the content itself of the Chalomos. The Sfarno likewise takes the Al Dvarav as a reflection of what irked the brothers about the way that Yosef conveyed this message. He insisted that listen carefully, pay attention to every last word, every last inference in the Chalom that I'm telling you. I would like to learn with you Rab Meir Simcha's take on this Al Dvarav. And then, if we have time, I would like to also share with you the Telzer Rosh Hashiva. His name is Rav Sorotskin. He wrote a book on Chumash called the Aznayim L'Torah. He has a very interesting addition here, an elaboration of this whole Al Dvarav. But be that as it may, we're learning now Meshech Chohma, so let's give due time to the Meshech Chohma. The Meshech Chohma is on the same line as the Ramban in terms of the Al Dvarav, not relating back to the Basam Ra, but Al Dvarav as a hemshech to the Al Chalomosav. So in that sense, Rabbi Meir Simcha certainly belongs to the camp of the Ramban and the Sfarno against Rashi. But he builds himself on a diuk, on a careful reading of Pasuk Zayin. And that Pasuk is the substance of the Chalom itself. And Rabbi Meir Simcha points our attention to something that we could blink and miss. The opening word in Pasuk Zayin is Vehine. Vehine anachnu malmim alumim b'toch hasadeh. We're not exactly sure why the emphasis here on Vehine. In the English translation, behold. Not only that, once again, in the middle of the pasuk, it says Vehine kama alumasi, and behold, as my sheath stands tall. And again, a third time, Vehine tisubenu alumosechem. A third time, Vehine. And the obvious question is, why is the pasuk, and Yosef for that matter, badgering us with Vehine 3 times over, when it doesn't really add anything to the pshat in the pasuk? So that question itself, calling our attention to that is quite brilliant. But I think the brilliance of Rabbi Meir Simcha is, with his scholarship, quoting a Sifri. Now, this Sifri in Parshas Korach is in the context of HaKadosh Baruch Hu granting the Leviim a wonderful gift of receiving Maaseh. And the pasuk opens up and says, Bamidbar Yudches pasuk Chaf Aleph, if you have a chance, you can open it up. Vani hinei nasati, and God opens up this great gift that he's bequeathing to the Levium with the word Vehine. And Rabbi Shmuel in the Sifri says, V'hine b'simcha. God feels rejoiced, so to speak, about the ability at this particular crossroads to grant this gift of Masros to the Levium. Furthermore, if you take a look in Arami Oved Avi, in Parshas Kisavo, in the mitzvah of Mikra Bikurim, when the Jew brings his first fruits to the Beis HaMikdash, once again, you'll see the word Vehine. Hevesi es Rashis Pri Ha'adama. Vehine. And the Sifri again makes the comment, Vehine besimcha. Imagine the joy of a farmer when he is zochet his first fruits and he brings them to the Beis HaMikdash. Says Rav Meir Simcha, this is what irks the brothers. Hu al pima de Isa b'Sifri Parshas Korach. Hine, says Rabbi Shmuel, b'Simcha. V'kan, and here in Pasuk Zion, v'hine anachnu, v'hine kama, v'hine tisubena. Ulesimcha mazu osa. What is the place, why is rejoicing in place over here? You know, you're telling and relating a dream that you had, and al kol prat simcha, on every detail in this dream, Yosef adds the element of simcha. He rejoices. Samach b'simcha b'mida gidusha. He is overwhelmed with simcha. It's not just a regular rejoicing. He is dancing in the streets, as we would say. And it's similar to a cup. You know, if you pour liquids into a cup, eventually the cup and the liquids flow over. So he's overflowing with joy. V'zeu shamar kosuv. That's the extra two words in the end of the pasuk in pasuk ches. The al dvarav al shediber shalosh pi'amim b'loshen v'hine. So again, it's not the content, or shall we call it the substance of the dreams at this point. That's al chalamoso, but rather it's on the way he said it. You can imagine, perhaps, in the light of this Rabbi Simcha, hine v'simcha, that Yosef was absolutely convinced that this dream was a prophecy in which he would rise to greatness. And he was so rejoiced, he was so uplifted by this dream, this prophecy, that he ran around sharing it with everybody. You know, when you're in a mood of rejoicing, you heard good news. You know, my son gave birth to a, you know, his wife gave birth to a baby. You ran around telling everyone we had a new grandchild. Everybody has this tendency of sharing with others a moment of joy, so that Yosef is telling everyone on every street corner about this great dream that he had, this prophecy that he received, and he shares it with his whole household, his brothers and his father, and he's gloating about it. That really irks it. That already is rubbing salt in an open wound. And that, says Rabbi Meir Simcha, intensifies the hatred of the brothers. You know, it's bad enough that you're telling us that you had a prophecy that you would be lording it over us, your sovereignty and your control over us. But beyond that, you're happy about it, you're boasting about it. And in a certain sense, although the Meshech doesn't quote neither the Ramban nor the Sforno, it pays to say that maybe the Rabbi Simcha is giving us more of an insight, shedding us a new light on the approach of the Ramban, that, you know, he was bragging about it, and the Sforno says that he was, you know, he was saying it in a way that that he insisted that they play, you know, hear very carefully every word, you know, listen carefully, you know, I'm the teacher and you're the student. But beyond that, to go back to the Chalom, you know, in the light of Rabbi Simcha's insight, I think we could say that between the two words al Chalamosav and the words al Dvarav, we should put a comma, and it's almost like in a positive phrase. Al Chalamosav, the tochen, the substance and the message of the chalomos, and then v'al dvarav in the way he said over the chalom. You see, in the Ramban and the Sforno, you don't know that. But al dvarav means divrei chalom. Go back to the chalom and listen to the word vehine that it appears 3 times. Now, I do want to share with you for a moment, and this is a little atypical of my style in a Meshech Chohma class, but there's an Oznayim L'Torah of Rav Sorotsky. And he says the following: the Gemara in Brachos talks about chalomos. There's a whole long sugya there on Daf Nun He, and the Gemara quotes Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan says that it's impossible in a dream not to have dvarim b'telim. There are always elements in a dream that are completely meaningless. They're nonsensical. And Rabbi Yochanan gives a mashal. He says that just like there's no such thing as wheat without the chaff, and the chaff is really rubbish, so too, in the case of a chalom, every single dream has some element of truth, but also an element of a klipa, of some sort of a chaff. Now, Rav Sorotsky points out that if you go back for a moment to Pasuk Vav, Vayomer Alehem, Shimu na hachalom hazeh asher chalamt. Says Rav Sorotsky, interesting, that the phrase Shimu na implies not just physically hearing, but paying attention as well. And he proves that Shimu very often means pay attention. We would say, I think in our parlance, hang on to every word. Why does Yosef introduce his relating the chalomos to his brothers with the words shimu, not shimu? Listen carefully to every word. Says the Oznayim L'Torah, fascinating. Yosef wanted already in his introduction to the chalomos convey a very fundamental message to his brothers. This is not a dream. This is prophecy. And I'll prove it to you, because Shimuna, listen to every single word in this dream, and you will find that there's not one word that's superfluous. There is no nonsense here. There is no Dvar B'Telim in this dream. And that contradicts the principle of Rabbi Yochanan in Brachos that Ein L'cha Chalam, there's no such thing as a dream without Dvar B'Telim. Says Yosef, if you listen carefully and you analyze every word that I'm going to share with you of the dream, that as I got it, I'm relating to you as I received it, and if you're meticulous about it, go over it and over it, you will find that there's no Dvar B'Telim in my dream. And that's a proof that it is prophecy, that this is Divrei Nevuah. And Rav Sorotsky goes one step further. He says that when a person receives a dream, he could have one of two responses. He could either say, all right, it was a dream. Maybe during the day I had certain fears and I dreamt about them at night. You know, people are complaining now that they're dreaming about corona in the middle of the night. You know, we're living in that fear. But you could have another response. And the other response is one of restlessness. What do I mean by restlessness? For example, Paro, if you recall, in Parshas Miketz, has the dreams about the Sheva Paros and the other 7 cows. And the Pasuk says that when Paro wakes up, Vatipoim Rucho. I'm going to try to translate that. His spirit was agitated. In other words, Paro had this premonition that this was not a regular dream. He wasn't spending his morning hours and afternoon hours before he went to sleep at night thinking about fat cows and lean cows. He sensed Paro. Again, this was the good guy Paro, right? Later on, we have another Paro that takes over. But this Paro feels that there's some spirit here, rucho, there's some ruach here, there's some higher meaning and higher calling in this dream, and therefore vatipoim rucho. He runs around searching. He goes through the yellow pages and in the directory, and who could possibly tell me and reveal to me the deeper meaning of my dreams? He's restless. And no doubt, Yosef had the same experience. He realized that this was not just a dream, this was much more. Every word was meaningful. And therefore, Yosef said that I have something that is prophecy. Let's accurately read every word and interpret every word in this dream. Therefore, says the Oznaim LaTorah, the Al Dvarov. Again, the Al Dvarov along the line of those who disagree with Rashi. That Al Chalamosav Al Dvarov, that the way that Yosef insisted that every single word has to be weighed carefully, and perhaps in the light of Vatipayim Rucho, Yosef was going around from person to person, his father and his brothers, and he was very passionate. And he repeated his dream over and over again, telling, listen to my message. There's a message here from the Almighty. This is not a dream. And then that incurred their hatred because they realized that he was absolutely obsessed with this dream, with this vision, with this aspiration to lord it over them. Now, again, you could always ask the following question: did they accept it as nevuah, as prophecy? Rav Sorotskin doesn't address that question. I would insist, and I'm not sure I'm right, that they didn't accept it as prophecy, but they understood that Yosef accepted it as prophecy, the Shimunah, and therefore, if Yosef is running around telling everyone passionately that I received a prophecy from God about my greatness, that's something that they couldn't tell. We go on now in the same perek to Pasuk Chaf Aleph. This is already the terrible catastrophe of Mechiras Yosef. And Ruvain plays a major role as perhaps the dissenting view to try to save his brother Yosef from the brothers. If you read the pasuk carefully, pasuk Chaf Aleph, Vayishma Ruvain, Vayatzileu miyadam. First of all, the word Vayadam, Rabbi Simcha points out, is totally superfluous. The pasuk could have read without the word miyadam, Vayatzileu. And secondly, how do you reconcile Ruvain's statement with Vayatzileu? Read pasuk Chaf Beis. Vayomer Aleim Ruvain, Al tishpechu dam, hashlichu oso el habar. And the pasuk indicates in pasuk Chaf Dalet, if you fast forward, habar reik, ein bo mayim. Let's throw him down into this pit. So one of the most famous Rashis in all of Torah is this Rashi. Rashi says, habar reik. Let's see if I can read it to you. Isn't there a redundancy in the pasuk? So the problem is obvious. And what? Throw him down into a bar that has nechashim v'akravim. So some of the commentaries, I saw this in the Tartmima, they want to interpret that the brothers did not, and even Reuven did not know, he was unaware of nechashim v'akravim. That's one interpretation. The Zohar already raises this question. And the Zohar is not convinced that Reuven was ignorant of the fact that there were nechashim and akravim in the bottom of the bar. Says Rameir Simcha, Bezor HaKadosh Erech, Ma Zeh Hatzolah. How is this called, described by the Torah as Hatzolah, to save Yosef? Im yutal bibar mole nechoshim ve'akravim. Now, Rameir Simcha does not quote the Zohar. I have here in the footnote a quote from the Zohar, but frankly, the Zohar is written in very heavy Aramaic, as you know, and I'm not sure exactly if the Zohar actually comes up with an answer to this question. But perhaps Rabbi Simcha is going to give us a clue as to what the answer is, and perhaps he's giving us a deeper insight into the Zohar. V'nireh, lefi ani daiti. Ki chashvu is a reference to the brothers. Ki hu mechuyav misa b'dei adam. Wow. This is the famous shita of the Sforno. Not the same Sforno that I mentioned earlier. I mean, the same person, Rav Vayeishev Sforno, but a different comment in Sforno, which is a very, very famous comment. And it touches on the issue of how is it possible, feasible, that the great Shiftei Ka, the brothers whose names are inscribed on the Choshen, the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol, each one had a corresponding precious stone. How could it be that the Shiftei Ka would have been guilty of murder, or at least attempted murder? And the pasuk later on says, "Vayisnaklu oso la miso." So I'll just quote to you some of the highlights. It's a very long piece in the Sforno, but I think it'll give us a segue into Rameir Simcha, that the word nekal, which is the shorish of the word vayisnaklu, yora al hamtza'o lahara. Omar, the pasuk is telling us, shechashu es Yosef belibo nuchal lahamis, meaning that the evil of Yosef made Yosef worthy of being condemned to death. And he says that Yosef is now approaching them. Yaakov had sent Yosef to look for his brothers, bishlom achichem, for peace. They suspected that, on the contrary, why was he approaching them? Asher limta aleim alila, to find some more gossip and libel against them. Oh, perhaps lachtiam, or to somehow trip them up and make sure that they sin, kadeshi yikal aleim aviyah, so that Father Jacob would curse them. And as a result, they would perish. Therefore, says the Sforno, the Torah tells us, Haba lahargacha hashkem laharga. He, Yosef, in the eyes of the brothers, is coming lahargam, where there is, the Sforno vacillates back and forth, which lahargo biolam hazeh or lahargo biolam haba. And the language of the Sforno is, tziaru belibam, in their heart they were convinced, v'chashu es Yosef l'nochel, again, nochel, someone who perpetrates evil against you. U'misnakesh b'nafsham lahamisam bi'olam hazeh o bi'olam haba o afilu b'shneim. Maybe he wanted to, Yosef's intention was to destroy them in this world and in the next. And therefore, if we go back to Rabbi Simcha, who doesn't quote the Sforno, he says, Ki chashvu ki hu mechuyav misa b'dei adam. Habal harga hashkem lahargo means kill him here on this world immediately. And you might ask, but Yosef is only 17 years old. A person is punished for his sins when he reaches the age of 20. He says, b'dei adam done in ben yud gimel. The halacha is that even a 13-year-old can be condemned to death. That's the Jewish law. Bidei Shamayim ain't done him ad ben esrim, but a person is not held responsible if he's technically not condemned to death in a human court, but rather condemned to death or to some punishment in the heavenly courts, but that's only after he reaches the age of 20. They believe, the brothers, that he was worthy of being condemned to death in this world because he was coming lahamisam, and therefore he's already 13 years old. He deserves to die. But Ruvain had a different perspective. Ruvain said that although he deserves punishment, he's been perpetrating evil against us, but there's no proof that he is endangering our lives. He does not have the status of Habala Hargach. And if he deserves punishment, then the punishment is Bidei Shamayim. And therefore, Ruvain feels that we have to wait until he's 20 years old. There will not be a punishment for his sins meted out by the divine courts until Yosef has a third birthday, 3 more years, and he reaches the age of 20. And therefore, let's throw him into the bar. And Ruvain's philosophy was that the Nechashim and the Akravim would not be able to destroy him because he was only 17 years old, and he did not deserve any punishment b'dei Shamayim at this young age. And therefore, Vayatzileu miyadam, he knew that he would come back to the bar roof and he would find Yosef alive and well, because the divine being would protect him under the law of Onesh b'dei Shamayim begil esrim, and he was younger than esrim. Now, in the next piece, Rabbi Meir Simcha has a brilliant thesis about when a person should make a bracha on a nes, on a miracle. And there's halacha that when you come back to a location where you experience the miracle, you have to recite a bracha. And Rabbi Meir Simcha brilliantly connects this with Ner Chanukah. So if we have time, we'll go back to this Rabbi Meir Simcha. But actually, I touched on this last year, so I'm hesitant to review what I did last year. So if you take a look at YU Torah Ayin Sham, But what I would like to discuss with you is some of Rabbi Meir Simcha's insights into the episode of H.S. Potifera. And this I studied for the first time last night, so it's really new to me. Let's fast forward to the last chapter of Vayeishev, that's Perek Lamites, and we'll look at Pasuk Yutes. Now, what happens is that, as you know, Yosef runs out, Vayonas Achuta, and she produces a whole libel against him. And the Torah records, Vayehi kishmoa Adonav es divrei ishto asher divrei elav leimor kadvarim ha'ela also li avdecha, and vayichar apo. Rabbi Simcha is bothered, as usual, by the sequence of the pasuk, of the psukim. He tells an entire story that begins in pasuk Yudalid and goes into all the details. He left his garment in his hand. She called out to the people of the house, spoke to them, saying, "Look, he brought us a Hebrew, and he's mocking us. And he came to me to lie with me. I cried out loudly. It happened then when he heard that I raised my voice, he left his garment beside me. He fled into the house. And the master comes home. She tells him the same thing. And then she says, the Hebrew slave that you brought to us came to me and mocked me. And I raised my voice. I called out. And he left his garment beside me, fled outside. And we don't find throughout this whole story that Potiphar responds with anger until we get to Pasuk Yutes. And she says in Pasuk Yutes that Kidvarim ha'ela asali avdecha. Your slave did such things to me. And then it says, Vayichar Apa. All of a sudden, his wrath burns inside of him. Now, Rashi says that, where is it? Just 1 second, here it is. B'shas tashmish amra lokein. V'zeu sha'amra kidvar ma'ela asal yavdecha inyonei tashmish ka'elu. So this is Rab Meir Simcha's opening comment here on this pasuk, in which he quotes Rashi, the Ace Tashmish Amra Loke. Now, what exactly did she say to him? We don't know all the details that incurred his wrath. And Rab Meir Simcha is like a student of literature, so to speak, if I can give that mashal, to read between the lines. You know, you read a story in literature, and very often the author, especially in poetry, will leave out certain parts, and he challenges you to come up with a storyline. You have to use your imagination. So I was fascinated by how Rabbi Simcha puts pieces of the puzzle together and gives us a whole new twist on what exactly happened, B'Eis Tashmish. And first, he lays down a principle which we're not sure exactly where he derives it from. It seems that this is a medrash. And Potifera v'ishto hayu chartumim v'kosmim. So they were magicians. They were like sorcerers. A kosmin are those who like read the signs, you know. And what Chazal say explicitly is that she, Eshes Potiphar, had actually a vision, a divine revelation. Sherasa kiyotze mimena lo shalsheles gedula. That through Yosef, she will have descendants who will rise to greatness. V'lo yada shemibita. She was unaware of the fact that that vision was not about her, that she would have children from Yosef, but really it referred to her daughter. And in fact, Yosef married the daughter and had a shalshelis of Gedula. And this is the Medrash Rabbah that says, Roa hoisa ishes potifera v'itz taglidan shalosh. She saw in her astrological stars, sheyasida lahamid mimenu ben, but v'lo hoisa yodas shemibita. Okay, fine. Now, if you accept this medrash, which I'm not telling you is the only way of interpreting these psukim in this whole episode, then it puts Eshes Potiphar in a whole different light. She had this vision, she saw it in the stars, and to some extent it was actually a true, genuine, real vision, but she misinterpreted it. It wasn't her, it was her daughter. So her motivation was a different kind of motivation. She wanted to now bring about the fulfillment of this vision and be the mother of greatness, of leadership. And therefore, the Medrash concludes with the words, Ki l'shem shamayim niskavda. Again, as I said, it's a whole different approach to understanding this episode. And it's not the universally accepted approach, that her motivation was l'shem shamayim. Now Rabbi Simcha wants to put another piece into the puzzle. And that is that even her husband, Potiphar, he also shared this vision. He was also, after all, one of the Kosmin or the Khartoumim. Ulai ra gam Potiphar came. V'chashav oz ki Yosef gam kein ra came. Now he puts another piece of the puzzle. That he and his wife suspected that Yosef also had this vision. And therefore, L'shem Shamayim niskavin gam hu. So that Potiphar is not going to get angry, could you believe it, at this Hebrew slave, because from this Hebrew slave, we are going to have greatness. We're going to have Gedulah. And therefore, if Yosef also had Kavanah L'shem Shamayim, then there's nothing to get angry at. He's just fulfilling this prophecy, this divine prophecy. So now Rabbi Simcha set the stage for the pivotal point, the turning point in this episode. At what point does Potiphar get angry? And the answer is when he becomes aware of the fact that Yosef is not l'shem shamayim, that his motivation is purely for pleasure and desire. And why does he come to that conclusion? If at the beginning, from the outset, he was Dan Yosef l'kav schuz, and now Rabbi Simcha puts another two pieces of the puzzle together, and he says that what kind of a relationship did she accuse Yosef of having with her? It was not a normal relationship. It was not the intercourse that would have brought about pregnancy and children. How do we know such a thing? We're missing a piece of the puzzle. She Yosef lo rotza lavo aleh kedarka shetucha lisaber. He wanted to play around in such a way that he would have pleasure, but without her getting pregnant. Rak lemala tavas libo asas. He was not motivated l'shem shamayim. And how did she convey this to her husband and prove that Yosef is interested in lemale tavas libo? Because she says kasher osa Potiphar. There's no question that Potiphar and his intimate relationship with his wife was motivated for taiva and for pleasure. Again, piece of the puzzle that's missing. How do we know that Potiphar, when he had relations with his wife, it was a kind of a pleasurable relationship minus the element of pregnancy? Hainu derech evarim. Again, derech evarim goes into details, the sugyas in Yevamis and so forth, about how two bodies can get together and have pleasure one from the other without having the direct intercourse that would bring about pregnancy. Kemaisa ervi onon, that they would have a relationship and then they would withdraw so that there was no possibility of pregnancy. That's the whole story of Tamar and so forth. And now, with the Gemara and Sota, he puts together the last piece of the puzzle. Shepotifar hayesaris kemosha amruzal shenis nistares me'esh shekara Yosef v'lachen vayichar apel. Gemara tells us that when Yosef came into the house and joined the household as the Hebrew slave, Potiphar's homosexual tendencies or potential came to the fore. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu punished him and made him into he was mesaris him, he was castrated, so that he wouldn't have this kind of a rape situation in which he would experience his desires, with Yosef. So that now, what kind of an intimacy could a saris, a eunuch, have with his wife? It can only be some sort of body-to-body pleasure relationship. It could not be the normal derech ishus that would lead and culminate with pregnancy. He would not be able to make her pregnant. He didn't have the capability to do so based on this Gemara and Sota. So it's fascinating to me how Rav Meir Simcha puts all these pieces of the puzzle together, and he understands at what point does Potiphar get angry. It's only when she says, Kidvar ma'ela. No, it's just like you and I when we have an intimacy, and it's only l'shem pleasure. I mean, this man was incapable of having children. He was incapable of functioning sexually in the normal way. That's what Yosef did with me. Because Yosef was not interested in my becoming pregnant. He was not l'shem Chohma. Fascinating presentation. In the next piece, which I don't have time for now, he raises the question and offers a brilliant answer as to why Yosef was thrown into a jail of what we might call political prisoners, Asirei HaMelech. That's what it says in the Pasuk. Why wasn't he thrown into the regular jail with the regular people? And Chazal have different answers to this question. But Rabbi Simcha has a particular approach in which he says that that a jail for political prisoners usually includes spies, people who are trying to organize some sort of rebellion against the government. And that kind of jail is a very quiet place because people don't want to speak to each other. Spies don't talk too much. They're very quiet people. And this would, in a sense, from the perspective of Potiphar, would be mechasa cherpas ishto. In other words, instead of throwing Yosef into a jail with all the local, prisoners, the petty thieves and so forth, who would talk day and night, what did Yosef do, and what kind of relationship did he have with Ashes Potiphar? So therefore, Potiphar, to protect his wife's reputation, he had him thrown in with the political prisoners. Okay, that's Rebbe Simcha again. I'm not going to learn that with you now, but we'll fast forward, jumping one piece to the end of this parsha, and that is the story of the Sar HaOfim and the Sar HaMashki. So we open up to the Chumash here, and we can actually learn just two psukim in Perek Mem, and it's at the very beginning of Perek Mem. And you remember that the Sar HaOfim, the Sar HaMashkim were found guilty in the case of the Sar HaOfim. There was some sort of pebble in the bread. Maybe Paro broke his tooth on a pebble, I don't know. And in the case of Sar HaMashkim, there was a big fly in the cup. Vayiktzov Paro al shnei sarisav. Paro gets angry at his two chamberlains or two officers. Al Sar HaMashkim al Sar HaOfim. And the story we know, Yosef is now joined by two new prisoners who have dreams, and they're very perplexed by their dreams. They come to Yosef, and Yosef interprets their dreams. In the case of Sar HaOfim, the dream foretells the destruction. He's going to lose his life. Paro's going to put him to death. He'll be hung up from a tree, etc., etc. In the case of Sar HaMashkim, he'll be replaced back to his original position. Rabbi Simcha opens his presentation by quoting a Gemara at the beginning of Meshech Megillah, and the Gemara there says that Hiktzif HaKadosh Baruch Hu Adon al Avadav, that the Vayeishev Paro, which indicates that Paro was very upset, he was very disappointed in his two, what he thought were loyal servants. It's really HaKadosh Baruch Hu who got Paro to be angry, which means that Chazal want to point out that this entire story is a development of divine providence to bring Yosef out of jail. Lasos Ritzon shall Tzadik Yosef, so that the Tzadik Yosef would achieve freedom. And now Rabbi Simcha, without even asking a question, answers the question. And with our detective work, we'll figure out the question. Why don't we cut out the Sarah Ofim from this entire story? All we need is the Sarah Mashkim. The Sarah Mashkim had a dream. Yosef interpreted the dream. Litova, and the Sarah Mashkim will be replaced back in his old position. That should be sufficient. Why the Sarah Ofim? The whole story of the Sarah Ofim seems to be absolutely unnecessary. So that in the light of the Gemara in Megillah, that this entire episode was orchestrated by divine providence in order to get Yosef free from the jail, why the entire thing? Why, leave out the Sarah Ofim. And once again, Rabbi Simcha learns the Parsha like we would try to analyze a novel, lahavdil, and see if we could fit a piece of the puzzle into this picture that was left out of the storyline. He says, Lefi Shebelozef, not for the Sarah Ofim and Yosef's interpretation of his dream, the goal of this entire episode is that the Sarah Mashkim realize and believe and appreciate that Yosef is an interpreter of dreams. He has some sort of divine inspired gift to interpret dreams. It's not that Yosef was very wise and perceptive. He was a person with good etiquette. If you had a bad dream, he wanted to give you a good feeling about the dream. And according to the simple response, what we would anticipate is that the Sarah Mashkim would say that Yosef potar midaito. It was his own interpretation. Litov, to say a good thing. A person has a sour face on a sour expression on his face, and Yosef wants to uplift him and be a good chum of his, and say things that he would enjoy. And well, what does Yosef lose if this doesn't come about? If the Sarah Mashkim will suffer some catastrophic end of his life, what does Yosef have to care about it? Oh, here's where we introduce the Sarah Ofel. Litlos ala eitz. Harei im ki haya b'der chachma v'ashara. If Yosef's approach was just using his intuitive wisdom, harei lo siken atzmo, he's really exposing himself to danger. Why? Pen lo yikuyim ken. Perhaps the Sarah Ofel would survive, and Yosef's invention that he will die will not pan out. V'oz halo nikom yonkom imenu Sarah Ofel. Look what anguish you caused me, you low slave, you Jew boy. Look at all the suffering I went through. The anticipation that I'm going to be hung up on a tree. And there's no question that the Sarah Ofel would therefore avenge Yosef. And now we add another piece to the puzzle. Yosef is smart enough to realize that by saying to the Sarah Ofel what he said and pretending to Ra, he is endangering his own life. Says Rabbi Simcha, the Sarah Ofim would let out his wrath on this boy who gave him the fear of death. And therefore, Bivadai, the Sarah Mashkim realized that Chochmas Elokim Bekirbo, this is not just a youngster who's, throwing out what he thinks is the right thing to say at the right time, but rather it comes from the divine being, Ubatuach Yiskayim Pisrono V'lachein is kiro lifnei paro, and therefore, when Paro dreams his dreams, the Saramashkim feels absolutely confident in giving the recommendation. It's going to take two years later that there's this Jew boy in jail. He's the one who will tell you the true interpretation of your chalom. So that the whole story of the Sarah Ophim is an integral part of the divine plan and the goal therein. In the next piece, he says, Shnei Sarisov. Why does the Torah add the word Shnei? We have a principle of miut rabim shnayim. Whenever the Torah uses the plural, it means two, unless we know otherwise. So it could have said Sarisov, and we would have understood there are two. What's the idea of Shnei? So Rabbi Simcha brilliantly quotes the Gemara in Yuma. The Gemara dashins in Parshas Achremos, in the story of the Avodas Yom Kippurim, the essence of which is the Shnei Seirim. And the Gemara asks, why does it say Shnei Seirim? It could have said Seirim, and we would have understood that there are two he-goats. Why Shnei Seirim? The extra word Sheni, Shnei, according to the Gemara, is Shiyu Shavim. They had to be exactly identical, the two goats. Here also, Shnei Sarisov, in some sense, in a cultural sense, means they were identical. They were equal. They were on the same level. And Yosef understood that there was no, let's go back a little bit. Now I shouldn't say Yosef understood. If the Saramashkim, who's mentioned first in this pasuk, was on a higher level, he was like Paro's favorite second in command, then once again, he would have understood that Yosef, with his wisdom, knowing that the Saramashkim was on a greater level in the eyes of Paro, and he was a higher status, that he would survive, and the Saraophim would get it. And once again, it's just the intelligence of Yosef. There's no divine interpretation that Yosef is offering. But now that it's Shnei Sarisov, Shavim, what would have given Yosef the intuition on a logical level that the Saramashkim would be spared and the Saraophim would be put to death? Again, Rabbi Simcha L'Shitaso, that God organized it in such a way that the Saramashkim would appreciate and acknowledge that Yosef was a divine interpreter of dreams. And in the next pasuk, it says, "V'nasata kos paro biyado kimishpat harishon asher hayisa mashkehu." Very verbose pasuk with details that l'chora, nuances that are totally superfluous. First of all, kos paro. Secondly, biyado kimishpat harishon. And once again, with his incredible psychological insights, to put the pieces and read between the lines, Rabbi Simcha says the following. The Saramashkim was quite careless when he gave that cup way back when to Paro, and he didn't notice that there was a big fly in the cup. What kind of a loyal servant would do that to the great Paro, to his great. So that even though Paro, in a sense, forgave the Saramashkim and he brought it back, he would still have a certain suspicion. If the Saramashkim is not totally devoted to me, maybe there's some element deep down in his psyche in which he really is not a loyal servant. For example, you remember the story of Big Son Viseresh, right, in Achashverosh. So there are those who are plotting to kill the king, and the Saramashkim should be absolutely loyal to the king and make sure that there's no poison in the wine. And the divine promise here in the dream came to fruition that Kimishpat Harishon, that Paro would see in the Saramashkim, the Saramashkim in the eyes of Paro would be exactly what Paro had trusted the Saramashkim originally, before the Maisa with the fly in the cup, have total reliance on him. And therefore it's Kos Paro biyodo, which means that the Sarmashkim takes the kos of Paro in his hand and gives it to Paro. Paro did not suspect the Saramashkim. If he did, he would have required 2 cups of wine, and he would have said to the Saramashkim, you drink first and then I'll drink second. 1 flask of wine poured into 2 cups, and that's the way the king would have known that the Sar was absolutely loyal and devoted to him. And this is Kemishpat HaRishon, and that's the story. Now, in the last paragraph, and we'll conclude with this, Rabbi Simcha raises a very interesting question. It seems that from the time of the dreams and Yosef's interpretation until the implementation of those prophetic dreams, there were only 3 days. And yet, the Saramashkim and the Saraophim were in the jail for a full year. Why was that part of the divine plan? Why was it necessary for the Saramashkim, the Saraophim, to be in that jail with Yosef for a full year? Why didn't they just show up, have the dreams, and then 3 days later, and then the Saramashkim hopefully would mention? And here, Rabbi Simcha again, in his complete originality, says that Yosef was about to become the viceroy of the great civilization of Egypt. He needed to be taught taksise melucha, which means perhaps the intricacies or the devices of government. He spent, Yosef, an entire year with the 2 most important sarim that were actually close to Paro, the Saraophim and Saramashkim, and they would schmooze, they would talk, and Yosef would listen. And God was giving them the opportunity, or shall we say, giving Yosef the opportunity by overhearing their discussions to get a brilliant insight into the inner chambers of Malchus and the very subtle devices of government, and that was all part of the divine plan. Rabosai, I want to take this opportunity to wish you both a wonderful Shabbos, Vayeishev, and also a Freilich Chanukah. And thank you so much for joining me. And it's always a great opportunity to learn Torah, to share with you, in this case, the insights of Rabbi Simcha Midvitz.
Thank you, Rav Berzon. Shabbat
Thank you
Shalom.
so
Chanukah
much.
Sameach.
Shabbat Shalom.